All right. So first of all, my name is Brian Koval. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Department of Natural Resources and Energy Development. Sorry, getting the jitters out right away. First of all, thank you for the invitation to speak to you all today. It's honestly a pleasure. And in fact, I've given a lot of webinars over COVID, and it's so nice to be in a room where you can actually gauge people's reactions. So I'm really looking forward to this experience and talking to you all today. So the topic of our conversation today will be management of sea trout in the Miramichi Watershed here in beautiful New Brunswick. And I will be talking about brook trout as well, just be forewarned, but there's some interesting stuff about them in there. And I do just want to point out this picture. Is there a laser on this? Oh yeah. So, this might be what we all want to be doing right now, but it really comes down to having good quality fishing in this province. So I thought this picture really captured that. So first of all, a bit of an agenda, just so you know what you're in for today. We're going to have a look at the Miramichi Watershed RFA. I know you're probably all very familiar, but we will touch on it a little bit. I'll also talk about brook trout and sea trout life cycles. And what I want you to do is throughout the presentation, kind of visualize where these species will be at what different times. And that's why I'm mentioning the life cycles. Then we'll get into our fishery goals as well as the fisheries management. And then we'll get into our data. So today we'll be talking about some fish barrier data. So thanks to those who helped collect that, as well as our blue card data, Crown Reserve data. And if you're not sure what these actually mean, once I get to that part of the presentation, I will explain. It'll all be good, so just stay tuned. Finally, I will end with questions, but at the end of presentations, I do like to put in something about what you can do to help. When you see a bunch of data, you might think, well, maybe I want to get involved with sea trout. So if you are, please get in touch after the presentation. So this is a picture that we're probably all familiar with, the shape anyway. It's New Brunswick, a beautiful province, and right at the heart of it is the Miramichi Watershed. So just speaking on the significance of the Miramichi, so I've spent about the last 10 years in British Columbia as a fisheries biologist. And when someone finds out you're a fisheries biologist from New Brunswick, the first question they ask is, well, how's the Miramichi doing? And that's like 95% of people. So this is something that people are, interested in, not just here, but far and wide. So if you zoom in a little more, I just want to show you some of the sub-drainage basins, the sub-watersheds. Of course, it's quite diverse. Today, I'm going to be speaking mostly on the Northwest as well as the Southwest. The Cairns is also actually very interesting, but I don't have anything on that, but perhaps the next presentation. So basically, just have a look at the watershed. The one thing I just want you to note right now is think about resident brook trout, the areas where they'd be populating. It will be within the watershed. They're not anadromous, but our sea trout, however, will need to go all the way out to the estuary where they'll feed. And of course, that just means that they're exposed to more pressures along the way, whether it be shoreline or other things downstream. So you got watershed in your head. Now we're going to talk about life cycles and how these critters fit into the watershed. So first things first, I've prepared a couple talking points on these, so I'll make sure I hit them. All right, so the first thing about these life cycles is their movement's driven by factors, of course. One being food availability. They'll be looking for aquatic insects, terrestrial insects, aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates, particularly the smaller ones. Spawning will drive them, of course, upstream. Water temperature, particularly in times when water's warming up and they need those thermal refuges. And also safety. Got to hide from the predators. There's got to be an overhanging canopy and things like that for them to hide in. And of course, they're not going to want to hang out in an area that's being frequented by an otter. So brook trout, as you all probably know, spawn in the fall. Till this time, they're mostly swimming up and downstream. They'll be avoiding predators, looking for food based on those factors I was just mentioning. Well, of course, in August, the brook trout start getting antsy, and of course, they're starting to prepare to go upstream to spawn. So then, in the fall, they will spawn. They'll make the nest, make the hole, put their eggs in, add the milk, which of course fertilizes them, covers them up so they're protected, and of course, then they'll swim back downstream, but the eggs will actually incubate in the nest, and they'll come out in the spring as alevin. Let's point that right here. And of course, once they use up that really tasty yolk sac, they have to go out into the big bad world and become fry with the par marks on the side, as you can see, eventually juveniles, becoming adults, and continuing the whole life cycle over again. Now, just some visuals so you actually have a look at what they look like, not just drawn. The alvin, very interesting. They have the yolk sac, look very cool. But of course, the fry, once they lose it, you can see this one must have lost it fairly recently, but it's developed those par marks on the side. And my good luck charm is actually a little vial. These are actually coho, but there's alvin, eggs, an eyed egg, and a fry in there. And yeah, it's probably good luck ever since I got it. But if anyone wants to see what they look like up close, just get a hold of me later. And of course, they get bigger, get those beautiful colors. Nice looking trout. That one's going to be put back in, guaranteed. Guaranteed. All right, so just moving on here. Let's see, there we go. So the sea runs, it's a little more complex. As you can see, they obviously some will actually stay in the creek, but they also have the opportunity to become anadromous. So there's a large quantity of prey for our trout in our estuaries, lots of little fish and other critters for them to eat, which will ultimately allow them to become bigger. But of course, like I mentioned earlier, they're also going to be facing more pressure as they go to the estuary. So while there's some early brook trout runs in May, it's usually well into June before most of them are migrating up the rivers. This is a good timing, of course, because the mayflies are out and then the caddisflies and the stoneflies are going to come. Lots of food as they go upstream, as well as other little fish. Yeah, so by, I believe it's late June, the majority of our sea runs, they're in our rivers. And although they'll be moving up and down the stream, some will even potentially go back to the estuary in the summer. So in the height of summer, you'll find these guys often in those deep, cool pools, obviously trying to get away from some of those warmer waters. But ultimately, once the fall comes, that's their time to spawn, and they'll do their thing just like the other fish, and the life cycle will continue once again. And of course, by feeding in the estuary, you can see the critters get a little bit bigger. So some of our fishery goals, you can't see the title up there, but that's what it says. A big one, of course, would be maintain sea trout populations at self-sustaining levels, to identify and resolve issues affecting sea trout populations as diverse as they may be, maintain and improve habitat, and ultimately ensuring there's good fishing for future generations. You know, we want to keep these smiles going on and on into the years. And so we want to make sure that we maintain good quality fishing, particularly in the Miramichi, which we all love. So there's going to be a series of key responsible areas for our how we manage the trout. I'm not going to read through them because I'm just going to go through the examples and kind of explain them as we go. So let's go for it. First of all, angler regulations. I think I pressed next for it to go. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so there's a series of tools that we can use in order to manage the fisheries. First of all, the angling regulations, which you can find in your handy dandy guidebook. 2022 is out, so if you don't have one, go get one. And first thing, seasons, important because you can control fishing at really critical stages of the life cycle, particularly times like spawning, quotas. If you're seeing a reduction in population, you may want to reduce the numbers. But for sea trout, a big important one here is the length limits. If we're able to cap it at a certain length, we'll ensure that the larger trout are able to make it through and spawn. So just a couple things that we use there. So this slide, you can't read it, but it's about our controlled access waters, our crown reserves, as well as our crown angling leases. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with these, the leases are a 10-year lease done by auction, where the reserves are something that you do, you go into the lottery, and if you succeed, then you get a raw day of good quality fishing. And so because these reserves only let so many people in per year, they can maintain good quality salmon fishing, as well as trout fishing, as you'll see later. Because there's 11 of these waters in this Miramichi. I have some data to show you. but essentially it's a good way to acquire that data as well, because the ones going to the reserve will report it. Obviously, habitat's always important. Maintaining healthy protected habitat. We do this through protection, assessment, assessing, and then seeing if there's any way we can mitigate anything, as well as enhancement, getting into action and making those improvements. There's also the status of stocks. It's just important to know what's going on with our stocks out there, even going as far as health. And well, how are we actually collecting the data? Well, here's some examples here. By netting, by a fight net, a trap net, you name it. Electrofishing, the backpack sort of Ghostbuster looking one, or the boat one, both are effective, as well as angling. And then of course the salmon/trout barrier fish counts. I added trout in there because obviously there's trout coming to the fence. And the two we're going to be talking about today are the Northwest and the Dungarvon. And I've gone as far as to circle them on this map, just so for those who haven't been there, this is where they're located. And they're a little bit different, which you'll see in the data. So, but I just wanted you to get a good idea of where they actually are. There we go. And of course, we also do angler surveys. And this is really important. So the Provincial Angler Annual Survey, it's basically reporting your numbers. You know, the pages at the center of your book, or, you know, the website. Well, basically, we don't have a very large percentage of people reporting their numbers. So we're not getting a really clear image from that data. If, for example, we had 100% reporting their data, we would have a pulse on this province of who's catching what and where. We'd have it'd be quite sophisticated, but unfortunately we need to get that up. So my big push, like if you take anything from today, it's to report your numbers and also convince others why it's important to report your numbers, because we're trying to make good management decision, and we would be able to do that a lot better with everyone else involved. So we also have our Blue Card program. I'm not sure if any of you have ever been around when a conservation officer or other staff have been around with one of these, where they'll basically collect some information, including what you're fishing for, what you caught, what the lengths are, as well as how many hours they've been out and things like that. And of course, we're able to use that data for to follow some trends and things, which you'll see a little bit later. And there's some others, but we're just going to push on here. So in terms of data management, we collect physical, chemical, and biological data. And one of the really important things I want to hit here is the watershed management, working together, like with all of you folks. We can certainly accomplish a lot more if we combine our efforts. It's a great opportunity to build partnerships, to get stakeholders involved, and in general, just manage the recreational fishery area based on everything we know. So issues and concerns, some things that we might think about if we are seeing any problems. One, I put climate change, obviously, because that's one of the themes of the day and something we're all thinking about. There's a number of items I could have put here, but I decided to go with the warming water in streams, lakes, and estuaries, something we're certainly going to have to think about moving into the future. Sediment can cause runoff from roads. It can affect the gill structures of fish as well as the invertebrates that they eat, and can even settle on nests, which can lead to suffocation of eggs. Pollution, whether it be point source or non-point source, not good, as well as invasive species, ones moving into the watershed, ones that are already there, and this includes plants as well as fish. And overfishing, I put in here because I want to get the point again. It can be mitigated by having accurate data for better management decisions. And of course, this comes from people reporting more numbers. So just to circle back there. Because yeah, it doesn't have to be. If we knew more, we would be able to avoid some of those issues. So just moving into some of the data, what I'm going to start with here is actually, the barrier data, of course, that's right there. So we'll start with the Northwest barrier because that's where we see the most sea trout action. It's the most relevant. So what I've done here, this is just a high level graph right now, pretty basic, but what you have here is the total trout, and that's the total amount of trout that have made it over the fence or barrier. Whereas the lighter blue are the sea trout. One thing you'll see right off the hop is that sea trout is slowly decreasing, whereas Overall trout is slowly decreasing, where the sea trout a little quicker. One thing that I saw on this graph, though, is the spike here in the regular trout population, where it did not necessarily happen with the sea trout. So not sure what was going on there. So, that was pretty high level. So I wanted to dive in a little deeper and get some more specific numbers. Okay. And what we have here is it's broken up into 4 different size categories. I wanted to see if maybe one size was maybe failing the most, but unfortunately what I've seen, or fortunate, is they basically are following very similar trends. Obviously some places a little off, but in general, a decrease in population over time. So you looked at the sea trout there, but what's going on with the trout overall? Well, plotted that, anything, sorry, I'm just gonna back up for a sec. So the sea trout, is what we would consider 14-inch and above. That's about 34, 35 centimeters. We're going to be certain that they were likely in the estuary. So 12 to 14-inch, what you'll see is it's been pretty steady over time. The less than 12-inch seems like quite a significant increase, but one thing I wanted to point out, and actually left this in as a teaching point instead of redoing the data, is this right here. So in 2019, they changed the barrier fence. So the mesh size was smaller. So of course they were catching the smaller fish. So likely some of these fish would have been caught down here if the barrier were used, but that's where that comes from. So when you're dealing with data, it's just important to note times when you change gear or other things. It might be something you need to factor in. Oh. And so kind of looked at those, and I thought it would be interesting to just have a look at sort of what percentage of the sea trout versus the overall population over time. And so what I did, plotted here from 2007 to 2021. As you can see, what's happening is there's a lower percent of sea trout compared to the overall population. So although the trout seem fairly steady, if you look specifically at those larger trout, they have been in decline. And I mentioned the Dungarvon. I'll speed through this. I know I'm nearing the end here. So this historically, as far as I know, had a sea trout run. These days, not so much. We're getting more of the smaller fish, but I still wanted to throw the graph up here just to show you it's been a slight decrease. So something we want to pay attention to, but not quite as concerning as what we saw with the sea trout. So I talked about the blue cards, and this is just some quick data for that. Basically what we've done, one of the old biologists worked through this with me, but he basically what we did was develop a release rating as well as a harvest rating. So release being when the conservation officer visited them, they were releasing their fish, versus harvesting, they were keeping. And what's interesting about this is it kind of shows you a little bit about the fishing culture in different areas. For example, parts of New Brunswick, you'll see mostly people releasing. It's a catch and release culture. Where other places, you'll see mostly harvesting. They're eating a lot of their fish there. But if you look at this, essentially in the Miramichi, generally of the people they visited, more people were harvesting, except for these 2 points here, where it actually reversed. One thing I thought was interesting was down at the end here in 2020, right when COVID hit, people stopped releasing them and they were harvesting them all. So maybe people needed to have a little extra food during COVID, who knows? So I thought this was kind of interesting. What it is it's the amount of trout caught per year, but it's per visit itself. So basically it says, how many trout were they catching upon one visit to the Miramichi? And what we saw was a steady decrease over time. I don't know if the fishermen aren't as good anymore or if the fish just aren't there. Of course, we need to have a little bit more of a look at this in particular. So I'll just go through some of this reserve data fairly quickly, the reserve being the data from those reserve areas. And what I started off by was just combining all the reserves and having a look at what the fishing's been like over time. And what I found was sort of a slight increase over time. A little bit of a downturn here, but it certainly bounced back over the years. And then what I went and did was I broke it up into 3 different areas. So within those 3 areas contains the reserves, but I thought it would just be interesting to compare them. So if you look at the Northwest, you'll see that definitely the most fish are being caught there, where Savogal, the fewest. But if you look at actually how many fish are being caught per rod hour, so every hour that they're out there, how many fish they're actually able to pull in, which says quite a bit about the quality of fishing. You'll see that the Northwest is actually in the middle now, even though the most fish are being caught there, means likely there's just more people fishing there. Where when you look at the Savogal, it's the least, but if you remember the last slide, it was the least. So just looking into different trends, of course, there's lots more work to do, but it's giving us an idea of what we have to look into. Of course, paying specific interest to the sea trout. So that's just kind of a high level look at some of the data we've been dealing with. It comes to this point now at what you can do to help. And of course, I want to hit this point again. It's all about reporting your numbers and talk to others about reporting your numbers. We want to get that pulse. We want to hear from you. We want to know what's being caught where so we can manage these fisheries to our best potential. And of course, follow regulations in your guidebook, no brainer, right? And support good fishing etiquette. Little cheesy, but it's incredibly important nowadays. We're out there enjoying nature, enjoying the sport of fishing. So let's just do it all together.